All right, on to our last speaker. I would please like to welcome Amelia Birch. Amelia is a PhD candidate at the University of Western Australia. She's based in the School of Design. Amelia's research is concerned with the combination of art, history and archival practice in exploring the life and works of the Australian interwar artist Agnes Goodsir. In 2020, Amelia received a first-class honours in History of Art from the University of Western Australia, and she was awarded the prestigious Jean Callender Art Prize for this achievement. She also holds a Grad Cert in Heritage Studies from the University of Western Australia and a Bachelor of Arts in Arts Management from London South Bank Uni. Drawing from her experience working across arts and heritage industries in Australia and the UK, Amelia has a fascination with the power of ephemeral historical material and what the unconventionality of intimate archives can tell us about the artist and their work. Amelia is presenting today on tracing the intimate archives of Agnes Goodsir and Rachel Dunn. So if you're there, Amelia, please take it away.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. So as you've heard from my introduction, I'm not an archivist. I'm more sort of archive adjacent as an art historian. So I hope my lightning talk still holds some interest. I feel quite lucky to be presenting after Geordie's presentation as well, as I think there's some crossover between our work. So I'm currently doing my PhD on the Australian portrait artist Agnes Goodsir. However, the more time I've spent researching her, the more I kind of constantly collide with the life of Rachel Dunn, who was Goodsir's artistic muse and companion. Their lives were so inseparably intertwined. Born and raised in Victoria, Goodsir moved to Paris in 1900 and enjoyed great success throughout England and France. Her sensitive yet striking portraits almost always featuring Rachel Dunn, winning her many accolades. After a career spanning 40 years, Goodsir died in 1939 and fell into obscurity, largely forgotten until Bendigo Art Gallery staged an exhibition of her works in the late 90s. Last year, I came across a quote from a descendant of Goodsir's in an article from that period. The journalist was asking about the nature of Goodsir's relationship with Rachel Dunn and if there was the potential for any kind of romantic entanglement there. And the family member rather diplomatically responded, "We don't know, and it's hardly relevant now." Now, I'm not bringing this up to disparage or condemn in any way, but as a scholar who had just started a PhD on Goodsir, and as someone who is committed to carving out a better understanding for her life and her work in art history, I really carried this quote with me. "We don't know, and it's hardly relevant now," has caused me to wonder over and over, what do we know? What can we know? How does this knowledge pertain to writing about a complex and overlooked figure like Goodsir, still so shrouded in mystery within the context of Australian art history? With these questions in mind, today I want to touch briefly on how the reading of archival fragments can support new art historical insight into Goodsir's oeuvre, how these intersect with visual readings of Goodsir's work, and moreover, how these fragments can be passed, understood, and written into her history. Next slide, please. Agnes Goodsir spent the last 40 years of her artistic career abroad in Paris and London, a world away from her upbringing in Victoria. Both then and now, she was best known for her beautifully tender portraits of her long-term companion, Rachel Dunn, an American musician and her most frequent model throughout the most significant years of her career. The two women met in London around 1910, and after spending the First World War together, Dunn divorced her husband and the partnership relocated together to the left bank of Paris, taking a top-floor apartment at number 18 Rue de l'Odéon. To contextualise this particular choice in locale, not only was the left bank a hub of artistic activity for the women to be submerged in, but amongst these streets, an insular lesbian expatriate community of writers and artists flourished. Cassandra Langer summarises the sheer magnitude of this community best as, I quote, "Every rich lesbian in the world was there. Never before nor since has there been such a coincidence of time, place, desire and money." Similarly, Diana Swami describes the interwar cultural impact of this lesbian web as reinventing the artistic chain of command from the left bank when, and I quote, "There has been nothing like it since Sappho and the island of Lesbos." Overlooking this streetscape, Goodsir would paint countless portraits of Dunn, evidently entranced by her singular subject from the site of their merged home and studio. Next slide, please. Interpretations relating to art and sexuality which went unacknowledged during the artist's lifetime has historically been a source of tension when writing art history. Scholars writing at the intersection of art history and women's studies have long struggled to carve out an understanding of lesbian lives represented through art. In her work on Romaine Brooks, Cassandra Langer identifies the danger of feminist art history that fumbles when it comes to the lesbian subject or artist, explaining that there is a tendency for the heterosexual art historian to kind of skirt around any discussion of lesbianism. This prejudice prevents researchers from grasping the full complexity and possibilities of the lesbian artist and her subject. When writing these histories, there is a recurring demand for proof of the existence of lesbianism over friendship. And this proof is generally required to be clear, undeniable evidence of reoccurring sexual contact, which is almost always impossible to discern, as well as being severely limiting in scope. I quote, "Marginalised relationships attract a scepticism that reinforces their marginalisation," Sharon Marcus wrote in her 2019 article, Sarah Bernhardt's Friend, and advocates instead for identifying evidence of shared houses, joint burial plots, and wills as fragments through which past lesbian lives can be located. Similarly, Martha Vicinus writes that to examine the lives and art of such women, one must be, and I quote, "sensitive to nuance, masks, secrecy, and the unspoken. Look to the margins, to the ruptures and breaks." Next slide, please. So in my archival research, throughout my forays into establishing a clearer understanding of how Goodsir and Dunn lived their lives from their top floor apartment studio on the Rue de l'Odéon, I do my best to remain critical of this abject notion of proof. I find myself thinking often of a paper written by Sally Newman titled The Archival Traces of Desire, where she criticises the lack of imagination and empathy in researching the lives of women who loved women from the past. I think a lot of researchers working with archives long for that kind of aha moment where they stumble upon some clearly written declaration that sort of proves their own hypothesis. I know I'm guilty of this myself with my work on Goodsir. But after reading hundreds of letters written by Vernon Lee to Kit Thompson, searching for explicit confirmation of a lesbian relationship, Newman asks us in her paper, when is it enough? When will we have had enough? Desire, words, pages, paper, letters. Enough evidence to satisfy this elusive conception of truth. She writes that in her search for written proof in this limited conception of desire, she ignored the true weight of the everyday in her evidence, the prolonged, unrelenting intimacy of two women's shared lives and domestic arrangements that perhaps needed no explicit announcement of physical passion, since it existed in the day-to-day intimacies that have not been acknowledged necessarily in the conventional romantic narratives of the hetero imagination. Next slide, please. When researching and framing the history of Goodsir's art, these fragments of the everyday relating to the life that she shared with Dunn are at every turn. Their decades of cohabitation in both London and Paris, their financial entanglement, their long years of shared holidays, the domestic inseparable mundanity of the everyday. When Goodsir died in 1939, she left everything to Dunn in her will. World War II was approaching, and Dunn was left to grieve alone in what had been their shared apartment. But she also bore the intense weight of Goodsir's artistic legacy. Shortly after Goodsir's death, Dunn wrote in a letter to Goodsir's niece, "The whole centre of my life was Goody, and I feel the only thing I have left is to do my utmost to do what she would have liked done." This explains the choice made by Dunn to arrange a transportation of Goodsir's artwork en masse from Paris and London back to Australia. Complicated by Dunn's own unstable status in France during German occupation, this effort took her years. Dunn's determination to cement Goodsir's place in the art saw her engaging in what Melanie Micah defines as an intimate archival act, common with female creatives from this period when one partner is left behind after the other one dies. Information, or in Dunn's case, Goodsir's entire body of artistic work, is collated by the remaining partner who bears the sole weight of interpretation and legacy, knowing that those who have the capacity to interpret said information may be generations in the future. Though the physical presence of Goodsir and her paintings was gone, once France was liberated, Dunn was drawn back to their studio on the left bank. She lived on alone at number 18, dying there in April 1950, and was buried in the same grave as Goodsir on the outskirts of Paris. These biographical fragments, the administrative details of a life lived and shared, make up one part of my research. But aside from these, I also consider the importance of Goodsir's obsession with capturing the figure of Dunn in her portraits on loop for decades. In her work on Archives of Feeling, Anne Kvetkovich requests that when deciphering lesbian histories, one considers the value of objects that might not be considered archival, to speak for an immaterial history that may not have been recorded, as sometimes, and I quote, sex and feelings are too personal or ephemeral to leave records. The administrative traces of Goodsir and Dunn's shared lives are there, but they are sparse, and turning back to her tender portraits of Dunn can offer affirmation and illumination in reading these fragments. These can be known through, first, the visual reading of these paintings, which is of course very common when writing about art, but secondly, the sheer number of portraits Goodsir painted of Dunn. When is it enough, Sally Newman asked us when met with the immense volume of Vernon Lee's letters. I find myself asking the same question of myself when considering Goodsir's portraits of Dunn as archival objects in themselves, how these objects are scattered across the country in state galleries due to Dunn's painstaking work as Goodsir's intimate archivist, and how these portraits could numerically contribute to that ever-elusive concept of proof. At the beginning of this talk, I referenced a couple of questions that I kind of felt haunted by throughout my research. What do we know? Why does it matter? I think an asset of doing a PhD is the luxury of having time to consider these questions. And I've kept these questions at the back of my mind while combing through archives for information on Goodsir's elusive life. To write a comprehensive art history about Goodsir when so much of her life has been lost or forgotten requires a great deal of archival research. But it's crucial, I think, to remain open-minded about what qualifies as part of that archive and the multitude of ways in which we can read these fragments when incorporating them into art historical practice, with scholastic rigour, but simultaneously with compassion and sensitivity. Thank you.
Amelia, I'll throw it open now to the floor if there's any questions on Amelia's research into Agnes Goodsir. Yes, there is one question. Two questions. We'll start at the closest to where you are.
Hi, Kate Pulford, Prince Alfred College Archives in Adelaide. Thank you very much. It was so fascinating and beautifully pictorial with slides. Thank you. What a beautiful painter. I just wondered, I have come across some work by Bessie Gibson, who's very similar era, and I just wondered if you had come across her work or her life at all in your path.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I am familiar with Gibson's work. I haven't come across her name specifically in terms of sort of Goodsir's social circle. She tended to not have many friends that were artists and instead have a sort of, her social circle was built out of musicians or sort of writers. So I unfortunately haven't sort of come across her in my research, but I am familiar with her work and it's really, really beautiful and also quite similar to Goodsir's.
Yes, I thought that was similar too in her sort of tender portraiture, and she was quite well known for her miniature portraits as well. And I recently discovered that our collection has 3 of her works in it. I'm just trying to build some background around it, so I may be in touch with you.
Oh yeah, fantastic! No, please do get in touch. That sounds brilliant.
All right,
Thank you.
We might move on to the next question down the front, lady in green.
Hi, Elliot Freeman from Monash University. I just wanted to say thank you so much for bringing this work to our conference as a queer archivist who's doing a PhD on queer visibility in archives. You articulated this beautifully for our audience, I think, and your point about ephemera being included in these archives has given me a lot to think about. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. That's very kind. It's been such a privilege to be here today. I know I'm kind of on the fringes of archival work, so thank you so much.
Well, I think the archives always welcome the fringes, so otherwise we wouldn't be here today. Were there any other questions, any online questions? Wonderful. Annie Rhodes, let us know.
There's just one question from Catherine Hall asking where did the art go when it came back to Australia? Like, was it at one particular gallery? Was it sold individually? Do you know if there's any retrospectives being planned or anything like that?
Yeah, thank you for your question. So when it came back to Australia, it was through an agent who I think was based out of the NGV at the time. So it kind of was distributed pretty evenly between state galleries. So most, if you look in terms of like most major galleries in Australia have a Goodsir or two that sort of sat in storage for a very long time, but luckily in the last sort of 15, 20 years, they've been pulling them out of storage and putting them on permanent display, which is really nice. So the majority of them did go to, a fair portion of them went to state collections. Another chunk of them went to Goodsir's living family, who were based, I think, in regional New South Wales at the time, and have sort of remained in sort of family care or have trickled into private collections since then. So kind of sort of a bit of both, but there are still quite a number in state galleries, which is really good.
Okay, that's all for online. All right, we might hold it there. Thank you once again to all of our wonderful presenters today. Susanna, Ailey, William, Geordie, Amelia and James. One more round of applause. And then it's afternoon tea. Thank you.